We think it's best you don't come this year. You'll bring down the mood with your situation. My mother's words hit me like a physical blow as I stood in my tiny apartment on December 23rd, phone pressed against my ear, feeling the world tilt beneath my feet. I was 29 years old, holding a junior marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle, making $42,000 a year and living in a modest studio apartment that smelled faintly of the neighbors' cooking and had a radiator that clanked through the night. I had been looking forward to Christmas with my family for weeks, had bought carefully chosen gifts I could barely afford, had requested the time off from work months in advance. Now my mother was telling me, in that carefully modulated voice she used when delivering unpleasant news, that I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner because my financial situation would somehow contaminate their celebration. Your father and I discussed it, she continued, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably arranging the expensive orchids my brother Marcus always sent her. And with Marcus bringing his new girlfriend and Jennifer hosting with David, we want everything to be just right. You understand, don't you, sweetheart? The endearment felt like salt in a wound. I understood perfectly. I understood that I had always been the family disappointment, the one who didn't quite measure up to my investment banker brother or my sister who had married a successful cardiovascular surgeon. Marcus was 32 and made more in annual bonuses than I made in 3 years of salary. Jennifer was 34 and lived in a sprawling house in the suburbs with her surgeon husband David, drove a Mercedes SUV, and posted carefully curated photos of her perfect life on social media. And then there was me, Sarah, the youngest, the one who had chosen a soft career path in marketing, who drove a 2008 Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door, who shopped at Target and clipped coupons and sometimes ate ramen for dinner because it was the end of the month and money was tight. I had grown up in their shadow, always compared and always found wanting, but this was different. This was being explicitly told I wasn't good enough to share their Christmas. Mom, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Are you seriously disinviting me from Christmas because I don't make enough money? There was a pause, and I heard her sigh, that particular sigh that said I was being difficult, that I wasn't understanding the nuance of the situation. Don't be dramatic, Sarah. It's not about money. It's about the overall atmosphere. Marcus is bringing someone very important, and Jennifer has planned this beautiful dinner, and we just think it would be more comfortable for everyone if you sat this one out. Maybe next year, when you're more settled. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The phone call shouldn't have surprised me. Not really. Because it was just the latest cruelty in a pattern that stretched back through years of family gatherings where I had learned to make myself small and unobtrusive, trying not to draw attention to the ways I didn't measure up to Marcus and Jennifer's gleaming successes. 2 months earlier, at Thanksgiving dinner in my parents' dining room, with its crystal chandelier and mahogany table that sat 12, I had made the mistake of mentioning my salary when my father asked what I was making now, and I had watched his face fall when I said $42,000, watched him exchange a glance with my mother that said everything about their disappointment. When are you going to get a real job? He had asked, setting down his wine glass with more force than necessary. And Marcus had laughed, actually laughed. That booming, confident laugh of someone who had never known what it felt like to be dismissed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. Jennifer had leaned across the table, her diamond earrings catching the light, and said in that syrupy, concerned voice she used when she wanted to seem charitable, "Sarah, honey, if you need to borrow money for appropriate clothes for family events, just ask. I'd hate for you to feel out of place." Marcus had spotted my car when I arrived, the Honda Civic with its fading paint and the dent I couldn't afford to fix, and he had made a show of walking around it, inspecting it like it was some curious artifact from a bygone era. "Still driving this thing?" he had called out while I was getting the pumpkin pie from the back seat. The pie I had made myself, because I couldn't afford to buy the expensive bakery desserts Jennifer always brought. Sarah, you know there are programs for people in your situation, like payment plans for decent vehicles. I had felt my face burn, but said nothing, just carried the pie inside while he and Jennifer exchanged knowing looks that said they were grateful, so grateful, that their lives hadn't turned out like mine. During dinner, the conversation had revolved around Marcus's latest deal, some acquisition that involved numbers so large I couldn't really conceptualize them, and Jennifer's renovation of their master bathroom, which apparently cost more than I made in an entire year. My mother had asked me exactly one question the entire evening, whether I was still renting that little apartment in the city, and when I said yes, she had made a small sound of disappointment and turned immediately to ask Jennifer about her plans for Christmas decorating. I had grown up as the youngest, always trailing behind my accomplished siblings, always hearing about Marcus's acceptance to Yale or Jennifer's engagement to David, always being reminded in subtle and not so subtle ways that I was the one who hadn't quite lived up to the family's expectations. And over the years, those reminders had burrowed deep into my sense of self, until I almost believed them, until I looked at my life through their eyes and saw only lack and failure and disappointed potential. The year leading up to that terrible Christmas phone call had been filled with smaller wounds, each one a paper cut that stung briefly before being absorbed into the accumulated pain of being the family disappointment. And I could trace them back through months of forgotten moments and casual dismissals that had taught me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of my parents' affection. My 30th birthday in August had passed without acknowledgement from anyone except my mother, who sent a text message 2 days late that said, "Happy belated birthday, sweetheart. Things have been so busy," as if my existence warranted only whatever attention remained after everything else in her life had been handled. I hadn't been invited to Jennifer's 5th wedding anniversary party in September, an elegant affair at a country club that I only knew about because she posted dozens of photos on social media, images of my parents laughing with Jennifer and David, of Marcus giving a toast with champagne flutes raised, of a celebration of family and success that apparently didn't include me. When I mentioned it to my mother a week later, calling to ask if I had somehow missed an invitation, she had been flustered and said something about it being just a small thing, and "We didn't think you'd want to drive all that way," even though Jennifer lived 40 minutes from my apartment, and I had driven 3 hours to attend Marcus's birthday dinner just 2 months before that. The family group chat, which included my parents, Marcus, Jennifer, and me, had been the scene of another casual cruelty in July when they started planning a vacation to Hawaii, discussing resorts and flight times, and sharing links to activities, their excitement building with each message until I pointed out that I couldn't afford a trip like that on my salary. And the chat had gone completely silent for 3 days before my mother posted a recipe for chicken casserole as if the entire conversation had never happened. My mother had made a comment during a phone call in October when I mentioned feeling stuck in my career, something cutting about how maybe if I had applied myself more in college, I would have better opportunities now, and the unfairness of it had burned in my chest because I had applied myself, had graduated with a 3.7 GPA from Washington State University with a degree in marketing and communications, had done internships and projects and everything I was supposed to do, but because I hadn't gone to an Ivy League school like Marcus, or married well like Jennifer, my accomplishments simply didn't register as real achievements in my family's eyes. The truth that I was starting to recognize, sitting in my small apartment and thinking about these accumulated dismissals, was that I was actually good at my job, that my boss Rebecca frequently praised my creativity and strategic thinking, that my colleagues asked for my input on campaigns and respected my opinions, that the world outside my family saw something in me that my own parents and siblings couldn't or wouldn't see. And this growing awareness created a dissonance that was becoming harder to ignore. A gap between who my family believed me to be and who I actually was when I walked into my office every morning and did work that mattered, that produced results, that earned me respect from people who had no familial obligation to pretend I had value. The Christmas phone call shouldn't have surprised me. But somehow, when my mother actually said the words on December 23rd, 2 days before I was supposed to drive to their house with the homemade cookies I had spent an entire evening baking, the shock of it still hit me like a physical blow. And I remember standing in my tiny apartment kitchen, holding my phone, and feeling the world tilt sideways, as she explained in that careful, practiced voice she used when she wanted to seem reasonable that they had discussed it as a family and decided it would be best if I didn't come this year, that the celebration they had planned was going to be elegant and sophisticated, and my presence would, in her exact words, bring down the mood with your situation. I had asked what she meant by my situation, even though I knew, had always known, that my situation was being poor by their standards, was driving a 12-year-old Honda Civic and living in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they considered beneath them and working a job they saw as embarrassing, was being 29 years old and not having achieved the kind of success that would make them proud to claim me as their daughter the way they claimed Marcus with his investment banking career and Jennifer with her surgeon husband and their house in the suburbs with the 3-car garage. My mother had made a small sound of discomfort, not wanting to say it directly, and then she had explained that Marcus and Jennifer would be there with their significant others, and they were planning a formal dinner with expensive wine and meaningful conversation about their accomplishments and futures, and wouldn't I be more comfortable somewhere else? Somewhere where I didn't have to feel inadequate, somewhere where I wouldn't have to sit through hours of listening to everyone else's success stories while having nothing of my own to contribute. I had wanted to scream at her that I was her daughter, that Christmas was supposed to be about family and not about net worth, that excluding me from a holiday celebration because I didn't make enough money was cruel in a way that I couldn't fully articulate. But instead, I had just stood there in my kitchen with tears running down my face and said, "Okay," said I understood, said I hoped they had a wonderful time, because that was what I had learned to do in this family, to absorb their rejection and pretend it didn't devastate me, to make myself smaller and quieter so they didn't have to feel uncomfortable about the ways they dismissed and diminished me. After I hung up, I had sunk down onto my kitchen floor and cried for 20 minutes, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. And then I had gotten up and thrown away the cookies I had made, thrown them directly into the trash because what was the point of bringing homemade gifts to a celebration I was no longer invited to attend? I spent Christmas Day alone in my apartment with a frozen lasagna and a bottle of wine that cost $8, scrolling through social media and torturing myself with photos of my family's celebration, images of them laughing around a table set with china I recognized from my childhood, Marcus with his arm around our father, Jennifer radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a caption that read, "So blessed to be surrounded by successful, ambitious family," that made me throw my phone across the room where it bounced off the couch and landed on the floor with a crack that spiderwebbed across the screen. And I spent the rest of that day crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, great gasping sobs that left me exhausted and hollow. But when I woke up on December 26th, something had shifted inside me, a determination that felt different from anything I had felt before, and I realized that I was done trying to earn their approval, done making myself smaller so they could feel bigger, done accepting their assessment of my worth as if it were objective truth rather than their own limited perception. When I returned to work on January 2nd, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating, and I walked straight into my boss Rebecca's office at 9 in the morning and asked if she had 30 minutes to look at something I had been working on, something I hadn't shown anyone because I had been afraid it was too ambitious, too bold, too much of a reach for a junior marketing coordinator who was supposed to stay in her lane and not make waves. Rebecca looked up from her computer with surprise, because I had never asked for a special meeting before, had always been the quiet one who did her assignments competently, but never pushed for more, and she said, of course, closed her laptop, and gestured for me to sit down. And I pulled out the folder I had been carrying like a talisman. The folder that contained 3 months of secret work, Nights and weekends spent developing a complete digital transformation strategy that would revolutionize how our mid-sized marketing firm approached client campaigns. The strategy I had developed involved integrating social media marketing with advanced data analytics and influencer partnerships in a way that created measurable ROI streams our clients could track in real time. And I had built mock-ups, case studies from other industries, projected cost analyses, and potential revenue increases, had essentially created a roadmap for how our company could leap ahead of our competitors and position ourselves as innovators rather than followers in a rapidly changing industry. Rebecca listened for 45 minutes, asking sharp questions that I had anticipated and prepared for. And I watched her expression change from polite interest to genuine engagement to something that looked like excitement. And when I finished, she sat back in her chair and said, "Sarah, this is extraordinary work. This is executive-level strategic thinking. Why haven't you shown me this before?" I told her the truth, that I hadn't believed anyone would take me seriously, that I had been afraid of being dismissed or laughed at, and she looked at me with something that might have been compassion and said, "I'm giving you a chance to pitch this to the executive team next month. Start preparing now, because if they approve this, you'll be leading the pilot program." The pilot program launched in early February, and by the middle of March, it had exceeded every single projection I had made in my initial presentation, bringing in 3 major clients who signed specifically because of the innovative digital strategy I had developed, clients who told Rebecca in meetings that they had been comparing firms, and ours was the only one offering the kind of integrated analytics-driven approach they were looking for in an increasingly digital marketplace. And I remember the day Rebecca called me into her office and told me the executive team wanted to promote me to marketing manager with a salary increase to $68,000. A raise of $26,000 that felt like validation of everything I had worked for and proof that my family's assessment of my worth had been fundamentally wrong. I didn't tell them about the promotion, didn't send a message to the family group chat, or call my mother with the news, because some instinct told me that one promotion wasn't enough, that they would find a way to dismiss it or diminish it the way they had dismissed and diminished everything else about my life. And I wanted more than one success story before I faced them again, wanted undeniable proof that I was capable of the kind of achievement they valued, even if I had learned that their values were shallow and their measure of worth was corrupted by materialism. I threw myself into my new role with an intensity that surprised even me, working late into the evenings developing strategies for our expanding client base, mentoring the team members who now reported to me, building relationships with industry contacts who could help us land even bigger accounts. And by May, a competitor firm approached me with a job offer, wanting to recruit me away with promises of senior-level responsibility and a substantial salary increase. And instead of accepting, I used their offer as leverage, walked into Rebecca's office with the competitor's written proposal, and asked if our company valued my contributions enough to counter it. Rebecca had looked at the offer letter with its $85,000 salary and said she would take it to the executive team immediately. And 3 days later, I was promoted again to senior marketing manager with a salary of $89,000, more than double what I had been making when my mother called to uninvite me from Christmas, more than I had ever imagined making at 29 years old. And with that promotion came the financial freedom to move out of my modest apartment and into a nicer place in a better neighborhood, to buy professional clothes that fit properly and made me feel confident, to start building the kind of life I had always wanted but had been too afraid to reach for because my family had convinced me I wasn't capable of achieving it. I found an apartment with hardwood floors and large windows that let in morning light, bought furniture that wasn't second-hand or salvaged from previous tenants, invested in a wardrobe of tailored blazers and quality shoes and accessories that signaled professional competence. And every time I walked into my new home or caught my reflection in an office building window, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my family's approval and everything to do with my own recognition of how far I had come in just 5 months. My mother's 60th birthday dinner in mid-June fell on a Saturday evening at an upscale Italian restaurant Marcus had chosen, the kind of place with cloth napkins and prices that weren't listed on the menu, and I arrived wearing one of my new tailored blazers over a silk blouse, with pants that had been professionally fitted, carrying a wrapped gift I had spent actual time selecting instead of grabbing something generic from a department store at the last minute. And when I walked up to the table where my family was already seated, I saw my mother's eyes flicker over my outfit without comment, no acknowledgement that I looked different than I had at Christmas 18 months earlier, no curiosity about how I could suddenly afford clothes that probably cost more than what I used to spend on an entire season's wardrobe. The dinner conversation followed its predictable patterns, with Marcus dominating the discussion by talking about his recent bonus of $45,000, a number he mentioned 3 times in the first 30 minutes, as if we might not have been impressed enough the first time we heard it. And Jennifer kept extending her left wrist so the candlelight would catch the new diamond bracelet her husband David had given her for their anniversary. A piece she estimated was worth at least $8,000, though she pretended to be humble about it by saying, "David spoils me. I told him it was too much, but he insisted." When my father asked me how work was going in that polite, distant tone people use when they're asking out of obligation rather than genuine interest, I said that things were going well, that I had been doing some interesting projects and had recently taken on more responsibility, and he nodded and said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately turning back to Marcus and asking detailed questions about his investment strategies and whether Marcus thought it was a good time to move some retirement funds into different assets. Questions that demonstrated the kind of engaged curiosity he had never once shown about my career. I watched this interaction as if from a distance, observing the family dynamics with a clarity I had never quite achieved before. And I realized that they literally could not see me anymore, that I had become so thoroughly categorized in their minds as the unsuccessful one, the disappointing daughter who would never amount to much, that no evidence to the contrary could penetrate their fixed perception. And when Jennifer asked if I was still driving that little Honda with a sympathetic smile that made my skin crawl, I said actually no, I had a different car now, but I didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask for details because she had already turned to show our mother photos on her phone of the vacation home she and David were considering in the mountains. I left that dinner early claiming I had work to prepare for Monday, which was actually true because I was developing a presentation for a major potential client. And as I walked to my car and drove back to my apartment, I felt something unexpected, not the familiar hurt or anger or desperate need for their approval, but a kind of liberation, a lightness that came from finally understanding that their inability to see my worth said everything about their limitations and nothing about my value. The email arrived in mid-August from a recruiter named Michael Chen, who represented a venture capital-backed tech startup called ConnectWave, a company developing a revolutionary community-building app that integrated social networking with local service coordination. And his message explained that they had seen my name in several industry publications covering innovative digital marketing strategies and wanted to discuss their open director of marketing position with a salary range of $125,000 to $145,000 plus equity in a company that had just closed a Series B funding round of $32 million. I almost deleted the email because startup culture felt risky and unpredictable compared to the stability I had finally achieved, but something about the timing and the challenge pulled at me, made me curious enough to take the initial phone call where Michael described a young, energetic company led by founders who valued bold, creative thinking and wanted someone who could help them scale their user acquisition from 50,000 to 5 million users within 18 months. Someone who wasn't afraid to experiment and fail and learn and try again. And by the end of that conversation, I had agreed to meet with the CEO and head of product the following week. The interview took place in a converted warehouse space in the tech district where 20-something developers worked at standing desks, surrounded by whiteboards covered in diagrams and prototypes. And I sat across from Aisha Patel, the 34-year-old CEO who had sold her previous company for $80 million, and James Rodriguez, the chief product officer who had led design teams at two major tech companies. And instead of asking me standard interview questions, they showed me their product roadmap and asked what I would do differently, how I would position their app against established competitors, what audience segments I would target first, and why. I found myself leaning forward and sketching out campaign concepts on their whiteboard, talking about micro-influencer partnerships and community-generated content strategies and data-driven personalization that could make every user feel like the app was designed specifically for their neighborhood and their needs. And 2 hours passed in what felt like 20 minutes before Aisha stopped me and said, "When can you start?" The formal offer came 3 days later with a salary of $135,000, equity representing 0.4% of the company, which Michael explained could be worth anywhere from nothing to several $1 million depending on the company's trajectory, and a title that meant I would be working directly with the executive team and have complete authority over a marketing budget that would scale with our growth. And I gave my notice at my current company with gratitude for everything Rebecca and the team had taught me, but with excitement about this new challenge that felt specifically designed for the skills I had developed and the boldness I had discovered in myself over the past 8 months. I started at ConnectWave on September 1st and immediately immersed myself in the product, spending my first week actually using the app in my own neighborhood, identifying friction points and opportunities, interviewing early adopter users about what they loved and what frustrated them, and then building a comprehensive marketing strategy that focused on hyperlocal community activation rather than broad national campaigns, a neighborhood-by-neighborhood approach that generated authentic engagement and organic growth. And by November, our user base had grown 300%, with acquisition costs that were 40% lower than the industry standard for similar apps, growth that attracted attention from tech media outlets, including a TechCrunch article that specifically mentioned my unconventional grassroots strategy, and a Forbes piece about innovative marketing leaders that included my photo and a quote about the importance of understanding community dynamics in the digital age. And through it all, I never once mentioned any of this to my family, never sent links to the articles or updates about my success, because I was so completely focused on the work itself and on proving to myself that I could operate at this level, that their validation had become irrelevant to my sense of achievement. By mid-November, the growth metrics had become impossible to ignore as ConnectWave's user base crossed the 200,000 mark with engagement rates that significantly exceeded industry benchmarks. And Aisha started taking meetings with major tech companies who saw our community-building platform as either a competitive threat or a strategic acquisition opportunity. Companies whose names I recognized from headlines and whose market capitalizations included numbers followed by the word billion. I sat in on several of these preliminary discussions where executives from corporations with thousands of employees asked detailed questions about our user retention algorithms and growth projections. And I watched Aisha and James navigate these conversations with a confidence that came from knowing we had built something genuinely valuable, something that solved real problems for real people in ways that existing platforms hadn't managed to address. And during one particularly intense meeting in early December with TechVision, a major player in the social media and community connectivity space, their chief strategy officer looked directly at me and asked if I would consider staying on as chief marketing officer if an acquisition went through. A question that made my heart race because it meant they saw me not just as part of a package deal, but as someone whose expertise they specifically wanted to retain. The negotiations accelerated with a speed that felt surreal as lawyers and financial advisors began conducting due diligence and valuations. And on December 18th, exactly 1 year and 5 days after that phone call, when my mother had disinvited me from Christmas for being too poor, I sat in a conference room alongside Aisha and James and our other key team members, while our lawyer announced that TechVision had agreed to acquire ConnectWave for $180 million. a number that seemed almost abstract until he began breaking down what it meant for each of us based on our equity stakes and vesting schedules. My 0.4%, after taxes and various fees, translated to approximately $2.4 million, money that would hit my account within 90 days of the deal closing, and I sat there trying to process the reality that I had gone from being the family disappointment who couldn't afford appropriate clothes to a millionaire in the span of 12 months. That at 30 years old, I had achieved a level of financial security my parents had spent their entire lives working toward, and had accumulated more liquid wealth than Marcus, with his impressive investment banking bonuses, or Jennifer with her surgeon husband and their careful portfolio management. TechVision's CEO called me directly the following day to formally offer me the Chief Marketing Officer position with a base salary of $275,000 plus performance bonuses that could add another $100,000 annually, plus additional equity in TechVision itself, and a benefits package that included things like a company car allowance and unlimited paid time off, perks that seemed almost excessive, but that he assured me were standard for C-suite executives at their level. And I accepted the offer while sitting in my apartment, looking out at the city skyline and thinking about how completely my life had transformed since that lonely Christmas when I had eaten frozen dinner alone and cried over Instagram photos of my family celebrating without me. I would start the new role in mid-January after the acquisition officially closed and after I took 2 weeks off to simply breathe and adjust to this new reality. And through all of this upheaval and success and life-changing financial windfall, I never once called my parents or siblings to share the news, never posted about it on social media where they might see it, never reached out to claim the recognition and validation I had spent so many years desperately craving, because somewhere in the midst of building something meaningful and proving my capabilities to people who actually valued my contributions, I had stopped needing their approval and had found something more sustainable and more precious, a bone-deep confidence in my own worth that existed completely independent of their assessment. The second Christmas since my exclusion approached with an irony that wasn't lost on me as I watched the family group chat light up with the usual holiday coordination messages, my mother posting about dinner plans for December 24th and asking everyone to confirm attendance. And I stared at my phone for a long moment, trying to decide whether I even wanted to subject myself to another evening of dismissal and condescension now that I had built a life so far beyond their perception of me. Part of me wanted to simply decline with some polite excuse about work obligations or travel plans, to spend the holiday with friends who actually valued my company, or to fly somewhere warm and peaceful where family dynamics and old wounds couldn't reach me. But another part of me felt genuinely curious about how they would react to the external markers of success they claimed to value so highly, whether they would even notice the changes, or whether their assessment of me had calcified so completely that no evidence could penetrate their fixed beliefs. I typed a simple, "I'll be there," into the group chat and watched as my mother hearted the message and Jennifer responded with, "Great," followed by a string of Christmas tree emojis, their casual acceptance containing no acknowledgement of the previous year's exclusion, no reference to the fact that last Christmas I had been explicitly uninvited because my poverty might bring down the mood of their celebration, and I realized they had probably never even reflected on that cruelty or considered how it had affected me, because in their minds, I was simply the lesser sibling whose feelings didn't warrant the same consideration they extended to each other. December 24th arrived cold and clear, and I drove to my parents' house in the Tesla Model S that TechVision provided as part of my executive compensation package, the sleek black car handling beautifully on the winter roads. And when I pulled into the familiar driveway behind Marcus's BMW and Jennifer's husband's Mercedes, I saw the curtain twitch in the front window as someone noticed my arrival. Marcus was standing in the doorway before I even reached the porch, his eyes on the Tesla with an expression I couldn't quite read, and when I climbed the steps carrying a bottle of expensive wine and a tin of gourmet cookies, he said, "Nice car, Sarah. Did you rent it for the holidays?" with a tone that suggested he found the idea of me in a luxury vehicle vaguely ridiculous, perhaps even pathetic, if I was spending money I didn't have to impress them. I smiled at him without answering the question directly and said, "Merry Christmas, Marcus," as I stepped past him into the warmth of the house where the familiar sense of my mother's cooking and the sight of the over-decorated tree triggered a complicated mix of nostalgia and detachment. And when Jennifer appeared from the kitchen and said, "Oh, Sarah, you're here. I wasn't sure you'd make it," with that particular inflection that suggested my attendance was optional while hers was essential, I simply handed her the wine and settled into the evening ahead, determined to observe rather than engage, to watch my family with the clarity that came from finally understanding that their assessment of me revealed far more about their limitations than it ever had about mine. Dinner unfolded with the predictable choreography I had witnessed countless times throughout my life as we gathered around my parents' dining table with its carefully arranged centerpiece and the good china that only appeared for holidays. And within minutes, the conversation had gravitated entirely toward Marcus and Jennifer's accomplishments, as though success were a gravitational force that naturally pulled all attention in their direction. Marcus launched into a detailed account of closing a major deal in November that had brought his firm a seven-figure client, his voice carrying that particular tone of false modesty that actually drew more attention to the achievement, and my father leaned forward with rapt attention, asking questions about market strategies and portfolio diversification, while my mother beamed at her golden son with undisguised pride. Jennifer waited for Marcus to finish before announcing that her husband David had been promoted to department head at the hospital, a position that came with additional prestige and a salary increase she didn't specify, but that her satisfied smile suggested was significant. And my mother reached across the table to squeeze Jennifer's hand while saying, "We're so proud of both of you. You've worked so hard, and it shows." My father raised his wine glass and said, "A toast to my successful children, the ones who really made something of themselves," and his eyes landed squarely on Marcus and Jennifer, while somehow sliding past me as though I were part of the furniture, present but not worth including in a celebration of achievement. I sipped my wine and watched this performance with a strange sense of detachment, observing the family dynamics I had once desperately wanted to be part of as though I were an anthropologist studying a curious tribal ritual. And when my mother finally turned to me with what she probably thought was polite interest and said, "And what about you, Sarah? Are you still at that little marketing job?" The condescension in her voice was so reflexive, I doubt she even heard it herself. I set down my fork carefully and said, "Actually, I changed positions recently, keeping my tone neutral and my face composed." And Jennifer looked up from her plate with that particular expression of patient tolerance she reserved for my attempts at relevance and said, "Well, any job is respectable, I suppose. We can't all be high achievers." And I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of amused wonder that they could be so completely blind to anything outside their predetermined narrative about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. I didn't elaborate or correct their assumptions, finding their confident ignorance almost entertaining now that I knew the truth about my own success. And instead, I let the conversation flow back to Marcus's investment strategies. While I looked around the dining room and noticed details I had been too hurt or too hopeful to see before, the water stains spreading across the ceiling in the corner, suggesting roof damage, the wallpaper peeling near the window frame, the general air of deferred maintenance that spoke of financial constraints my parents were trying to hide. Later, when my father mentioned in passing that property taxes in their neighborhood had increased substantially, and that keeping up the house was becoming more challenging, I filed that information away with the same careful attention I had once applied to analyzing market data for campaigns, sensing that this detail would become relevant sooner than any of us expected. And I finished my meal in silence while my family continued to celebrate achievements they valued and dismiss the success they couldn't see because they had never bothered to actually look at who I had become. After dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen, helping to clear plates, because some old habits died hard no matter how much perspective I had gained. And Jennifer followed me in carrying the gravy boat and a serving platter, her heels clicking on the tile floor with that confident rhythm that had always seemed to announce her superiority. She set the dishes on the counter and turned to me with an expression I had seen countless times before, that particular combination of pity and condescension that she probably thought looked like sisterly concern, and she said, "Listen, Sarah, I know money is tight for you. It always has been. And I just want you to know that if you need help, you can ask. I'd hate for you to be embarrassed or struggling alone during the holidays." I continued rinsing plates and loading them into the dishwasher, my hands steady, even as I felt my patience beginning to fray after an entire evening of dismissal and condescension, and Jennifer continued as though my silence was confirmation of her assumptions. "Actually, there's a family brunch next weekend at that new place downtown. I know it's a bit pricey, but we'd love for you to come. And I'd be happy to cover your meal so you don't have to worry about the cost." Something hot and sharp twisted in my chest at her casual offer to pay for my food, as though I were a charity case she needed to support, and I turned off the water and faced her directly, seeing the self-satisfied expression of someone who thought they were being generous when they were actually being insulting. But before I could decide whether to finally speak the truth about my situation, I heard Marcus's voice carrying from the living room saying, "Dad, you have to see this watch. It's a limited edition Rolex. Set me back 12,000, but it's an investment piece." I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked back into the living room with Jennifer following behind me. And there was Marcus with his wrist extended toward our father, who was examining the watch with the kind of reverence he had never shown toward anything I had accomplished, and my father said, "Now that's the kind of success we raised you for, son, the ability to appreciate quality and make purchases that reflect your status in the world." Marcus beamed under the praise and caught sight of me standing in the doorway, and my father turned and looked directly at me with an expression that might have been meant as encouraging, but landed as pitying, and said, "You know, Sarah, maybe Marcus could give you some career advice, help you get on track and figure out how to move up in your field. It's never too late to turn things around." I stood there at the threshold between the kitchen and living room, at the crossroads of speaking truth or maintaining silence, and I felt the weight of every dismissal and every assumption they had made about me pressing down like a physical force. And in that moment, I had to choose whether to reveal who I had become or let them continue living in their comfortable delusion about my place in the family hierarchy. I met my father's eyes and then looked at Marcus with his $12,000 watch and Jennifer hovering behind me with her offer to pay for my brunch, and I felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger exactly, but a calm certainty that the time for revelation would come soon. Just not tonight, when they were so wrapped up in their own narrative that they couldn't possibly hear truth, even if I spoke it directly. I smiled at my father and said simply, "That's very thoughtful, Dad. I'll keep that in mind." And I watched the relief cross his face at my compliance, at my acceptance of my assigned role as the struggling daughter who needed guidance. And I finished helping with the dishes and left earlier than usual, claiming fatigue from work, driving home in my Tesla, while my family undoubtedly discussed my situation with that mixture of concern and superiority that had defined their treatment of me for as long as I could remember. And I knew with absolute certainty that when the moment came for truth, it would be on my terms and in my timing, and I was content to wait for exactly the right opportunity to show them who I actually was. New Year passed in a blur of strategic planning sessions and company restructuring meetings as I settled fully into my role as Chief Marketing Officer at Tech Vision, spending the first 2 weeks of January immersed in building my team and developing the comprehensive marketing vision that would guide the company through its next phase of growth following the acquisition. On January 15th, a Tuesday afternoon when I was reviewing campaign analytics in my corner office with its view of the city skyline, my phone rang with a call from my mother, and I stared at her name on the screen for a moment because phone calls were unusual in our family, where most communication happened through terse text messages in the group chat. I answered and immediately heard the stress in her voice, that particular tightness that indicated something was seriously wrong, and she said, "Sarah, honey, we need to discuss a family matter, something important that affects all of us." And I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation, even as I kept my voice neutral and said, "What's going on, Mom?" She took a breath and launched into an explanation that came out in a rushed tumble of words about how my father's consulting business had been declining for the past 18 months, how they had depleted their savings dealing with my father's medical bills from a health scare last fall that I hadn't even been told about, and how they had fallen behind on their property taxes to the point where they now owed $8,200 that needed to be paid within 30 days, or the county would place a tax lien on their house, the home they had lived in for 35 years, and that represented their primary retirement security. My mother's voice trembled as she said, "We're asking all the kids to contribute what they can. We hate to ask, but we're desperate and we don't know where else to turn." And I could hear the shame and fear underneath her words, even as I processed the irony of them coming to me for financial help after years of treating me like the family failure. She continued quickly as though afraid I would refuse before she finished speaking. "Marcus has pledged $2,000 and Jennifer is contributing $1,500 with David's help, and we were hoping you could manage maybe $500. Whatever you can manage without straining yourself. We know your situation is tight and we don't want to put you in a difficult position." I leaned back in my leather executive chair and looked out at the city spread below me, at the evidence of success that my family had never bothered to see, and I asked quietly, "What happens if you can't raise the full amount?" My mother's voice broke slightly as she said, "We lose the house eventually, or at least have this lien hanging over us that would complicate everything if we ever needed to sell or refinance. This house is all we have, Sarah. It's our security and our legacy." I felt something settle in my chest, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that the moment I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting had finally arrived, and I said, "I understand, Mom, this is serious and I want to help. Let me think about what I can do and I'll get back to you soon." And after we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about family and worth and the strange mathematics of value that had defined my entire life. I sat in my office for nearly an hour after hanging up with my mother, watching the winter sunlight fade across the city skyline as I processed the reality that my parents needed $8,200 and had asked me for $500 while my brother contributed $2,000 and my sister $1,500. The mathematical breakdown of their assessment of my worth spelled out with painful precision in those numbers. I could write a check for the entire amount right now and never notice the money missing from my account. Could solve their entire crisis with less financial impact than Marcus would feel contributing his pledged $2,000, and the ease with which I could help them stood in stark contrast to their assumption that $500 would strain my budget. I pulled up my bank account on my computer and looked at the balance, at the number that represented not just money, but years of work and risk and belief in myself, when no one else had believed in me. And I thought about that Christmas morning 2 years ago, when my mother had called to uninvite me, because my poverty would bring down the mood of their celebration. This wasn't about revenge, because revenge would be refusing to help them, letting them lose their house, or scramble to find the money elsewhere while I watched their desperation with cold satisfaction. But that wasn't who I was, and that wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was something more complicated than revenge and more necessary than simple generosity. I wanted them to see me, really see me, not as the failure they had decided I was, or even as the success I had become, but as the person I had always been underneath their dismissive assumptions and casual cruelty. I wanted recognition not of my bank account, but of the fact that I had worth before the money, and would have worth without it, that their assessment of me had been wrong, not because my circumstances had changed, but because their assessment had never been based on who I actually was. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my personal checkbook, the one with my name printed in elegant script across the top. And I thought about what it would mean to simply mail them a check for $8,200 with a brief note, how that would solve their immediate problem while leaving our fundamental dynamic unchanged. Then I picked up my phone and called my mother back, and when she answered with that hopeful, anxious tone that expected bad news, I said, "Mom, I want to help with this situation, but I think we need to discuss it in person, all of us together as a family." And I could hear the confusion in her voice as she said, "Oh, well, that's not really necessary. You can just send whatever you can contribute, and we'll be grateful for anything." I insisted gently but firmly that I wanted to have a family meeting at their house, that this was important to me, and I needed everyone to be there. And eventually she agreed, suggesting the following Saturday afternoon. And I could hear in her voice that she assumed I was going to explain in person why I couldn't contribute much, perhaps ask for more time or apologize for my financial limitations. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the week preparing, gathering documentation that I had never thought I would need to prove my worth to my own family. Copies of my employment contract with the salary clearly specified, my most recent bank statements with the account balances visible, the TechCrunch article about the acquisition that featured my photograph and title, and my tax returns showing income that exceeded anything my siblings had ever earned. I organized everything in a leather portfolio, and as I did, I felt not triumph but a strange sadness that it had come to this, that I needed evidence and documentation to make my family see what should have been visible all along. Saturday afternoon arrived cold and gray, the kind of January day where the winter sky seems to press down on everything, and I drove to my parents' house with the leather portfolio on my passenger seat, feeling like it contained either vindication or just more proof of how broken our family had become. I arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, parking my Tesla in the driveway behind Marcus's BMW and Jennifer's Mercedes SUV, and I sat for a moment gathering myself before picking up the portfolio and walking to the front door that I had entered 1,000 times throughout my life, though never quite like this. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face drawn with stress and something that might have been embarrassment, and she hugged me quickly while saying, "Thank you for coming, Sarah. I know this is awkward, but we really appreciate you being here." And I followed her into the living room where everyone was already assembled, like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. My father sat in his usual armchair looking older than I remembered, the financial stress evident in the new lines around his eyes. And Marcus occupied the sofa with his legs crossed in that confident pose he always adopted, while Jennifer sat beside him with her husband David. And they all looked at me with expressions ranging from my parents' anxious hope to my siblings' barely concealed pity for what they assumed would be my inadequate contribution. My father cleared his throat and began with forced formality. "We appreciate everyone coming together. As you all know, your mother and I are facing a financial difficulty that we never anticipated. We've always been careful with money, but between the business downturn and the medical expenses, we've fallen behind on our property taxes to the tune of $8,200 that needs to be paid within 30 days, or the county will place a lien on our house." The words hung in the air heavy with shame and fear, and I watched my mother reach for my father's hand as he continued. "We've asked our children to help us, because we have nowhere else to turn, and because family is supposed to support each other in times of crisis, and we're grateful that Marcus and Jennifer have already pledged their contributions." Marcus straightened slightly and announced with the air of someone expecting applause, "I'm contributing $2,000. It's a stretch with my own expenses, but family comes first." And he said it like he was bestowing a great gift rather than helping his parents avoid losing their home. Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out a check with a flourish. "David and I are giving $1,500. We wish it could be more, but with the kids' private school tuition and our mortgage, it's what we can manage." And David nodded seriously as though they had made some great sacrifice, and then all eyes turned to me. My mother's voice was gentle, almost apologetic, as she said, "Sarah, dear, we know you'll contribute what you can. We're not expecting you to match your brother and sister. Even $500 would help us get closer to what we need." And I saw in her expression the complete certainty that I would fumble through some explanation of my limited means and probably offer less than they'd asked for. I set my portfolio on the coffee table in front of me and looked at each of them in turn. At the family that had spent my entire life measuring my worth in dollars and finding me deficient, and I said quietly, "Before we discuss my contribution, I'd like to understand something." I looked at my mother first and asked quietly, "Mom, do you know what I do for a living?" And I watched confusion flicker across her face before she answered, "Marketing, dear. Some kind of coordinator position, I think." And my father added helpfully, "At that small company, right? The one you joined a few years ago?" And I turned to Marcus and Jennifer and asked them the same question, making eye contact with each of them in turn. Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the sofa and said, "Honestly, no, not specifically. Social media stuff or something like that." And he said it with that dismissive tone that implied my work was frivolous and unimportant, while Jennifer sighed with obvious impatience and said, "Does it matter? We're here about Mom and Dad, not about your job." And I saw in her expression the familiar assumption that I was making the conversation about myself when more important matters were at hand. I let the silence stretch for a moment, let them sit with the reality that none of them could answer this most basic question about my life, and then I said clearly, "It matters because 2 Christmases ago, you banned me from the family celebration because I was too poor." And the room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and dangerous, like the air before a storm. My mother's face flushed and she started to speak. "Sarah, we never said that exactly. You're taking it out of context." But I reached for my phone and pulled up the voicemail that I had saved for 2 years. The one I had listened to dozens of times in moments when I doubted myself, and I played it on speaker for everyone to hear. My mother's voice came through the phone, tinny but clear, those exact words that had broken something fundamental in our relationship. "We think it's best you don't come this year. You'll bring down the mood with your situation. Maybe next year when things are better for you." And I watched my mother's face crumble as she heard her own words played back to her, words she probably thought I had forgotten or forgiven. Marcus looked uncomfortable and muttered something about that being a long time ago, and Jennifer stared at her hands, and my father cleared his throat but said nothing, and I put my phone back down on the coffee table next to the leather portfolio that held all the evidence of who I actually was versus who they had decided I was. I looked at each of them again and said, "You excluded me from Christmas, from the family celebration that is supposed to be about love and togetherness, because you judged me financially insufficient to be in your presence, because my poverty would bring down the mood of your elegant dinner." And I heard my voice stay steady, even though I could feel 2 years of pain rising in my throat, threatening to choke me. Marcus leaned forward with his hands clasped between his knees and said, "That was different, Sarah. We were planning an elegant dinner with very specific expectations, and it wasn't personal." And I watched him try to minimize what they had done, try to make it sound reasonable and justified, and I said quietly, "You excluded me based on my perceived financial worth. You decided I wasn't successful enough to sit at your table." And Jennifer made an exasperated sound and said, "You're being dramatic. We're family. Families have disagreements and misunderstandings. You can't hold on to this forever." And I felt something hard and cold settle in my chest at her dismissal, at her attempt to reframe my exclusion as a simple misunderstanding rather than a deliberate judgment of my value as a human being. I looked at Jennifer and said, "Then as family, you should know about my life. You should know what I do and who I am and what I've accomplished." And I reached for the leather portfolio and opened it slowly, deliberately, while they all watched with varying expressions of confusion and impatience. And I pulled out the first document, a printed article from TechCrunch with a photograph and headline clearly visible. I laid it on the coffee table facing them and said clearly, "I'm Chief Marketing Officer at TechVision. Maybe you saw the acquisition news last month when it was covered in every major business publication." And I watched their faces as they looked at the article, at my photograph next to the headline announcing the acquisition, at my name and title printed in bold letters. My father reached for the article with a trembling hand and picked it up, holding it close to his face as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And he said, "This is you? You're the CMO?" And his voice held complete disbelief, as though the idea of me in an executive position was fundamentally impossible to comprehend. I pulled out my employment contract next, the relevant pages with my title and compensation clearly marked, and I laid it on the coffee table next to the article and said, "My base salary is $275,000 annually, plus a performance bonus structure that could add another 100,000, plus the remaining equity I hold from the acquisition that vested over the past year." And I watched Marcus's face drain of all color as he did the mental math and realized that I earned significantly more than his investment banker's salary. Jennifer stared at the documents without speaking, her mouth slightly open, and David leaned forward to look at the contract as though he needed to verify it was real. And my mother pressed her hand to her mouth and said nothing at all, while my father kept looking from the article to my face and back again, as though trying to reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the executive in the photograph. Marcus finally found his voice and said weakly, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I looked at him with all the accumulated hurt of 2 years and said, "I did tell you. I tried to tell you at every family gathering. I mentioned my promotion at Mom's birthday dinner in June, and Dad changed the subject back to your bonus within 30 seconds. I mentioned changing companies at Thanksgiving, and Jennifer said any job was respectable, I suppose, as though I should be grateful for her condescension." And I watched him flinch at the accuracy of my recounting. I pulled out the next document from my portfolio, a timeline I had created showing every milestone of my career over the past 2 years, and I walked them through it methodically, making them understand exactly what had happened after they had excluded me from Christmas. I told them about January 2nd when I walked into my boss Rebecca's office with the digital transformation strategy I had been developing in secret, about the 3 weeks I spent working nights and weekends to prepare my presentation, about the moment the executives approved my pilot program and how that campaign exceeded every projection by March and brought in 3 major clients. I told them about my promotion to marketing manager with a salary of $68,000, and I watched Marcus shift uncomfortably because he remembered mocking my $42,000 salary at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I told them about being headhunted in May and using that offer to negotiate a senior marketing manager position at $89,000. And I saw Jennifer's eyes widen as she realized I had been climbing while she assumed I was stagnating. I told them about the tech startup reaching out in August, about the risk I took accepting a director of marketing position with a base salary of $135,000 plus equity, about how the company's user base grew 300% in 3 months because of strategies I developed and implemented. I told them about the acquisition in December, exactly 1 year after they had banned me from Christmas, about how the company sold for $180 million, and my equity stake was worth $2.4 million after taxes. And I watched Marcus's face go completely white as he processed that number, as he realized I had more money in the bank than he would likely accumulate in a decade. I told them about the acquiring company offering me the chief marketing officer position with my current salary and benefits, about seeing my name and photograph in TechCrunch and Forbes and Business Insider, about being invited to speak at industry conferences and being recognized as an innovative leader in digital marketing strategy. My mother's face crumpled and she whispered, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I felt something hard and painful twist in my chest, because she still didn't understand. She still thought this was about communication, rather than about their fundamental inability to see me as valuable. I looked directly at her and said, "I tried to tell you. I tried at every single family gathering I mentioned my promotion at your birthday dinner in June, and you never asked a single follow-up question." Dad turned the conversation back to Marcus's bonus within 30 seconds, like my achievement didn't even register as real. And I watched her flinch at the specific memory. I turned to my father and continued, "I mentioned changing companies at Thanksgiving, And you said that's nice, dear, in the exact same tone you'd use if I told you I bought new shoes. And Jennifer said any job is respectable, I suppose, as though I should be grateful for her condescension, as though my career was something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. And my father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. My father cleared his throat and attempted recovery, his voice taking on a forced heartiness that made my skin crawl. Well, this is wonderful news, Sarah. We're so proud of you. This is exactly the kind of success we always knew you were capable of. And I looked at him steadily and asked, Are you? Are you proud of me? Or are you proud of the salary? Are you proud of what I accomplished? Or are you just recalculating my value based on the number in my bank account? And the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. I looked at each of them in turn and said clearly, You valued Marcus and Jennifer for their money and status. You measured their worth by their salaries and their possessions and their prestigious careers. And you dismissed me for lacking those external markers of success. You literally excluded me from Christmas because my poverty would bring down the mood. And I let that truth hang in the air between us. I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke me. Now I have those same external markers. Now I have the money and the title and the Tesla in the driveway, and suddenly I matter to you. Suddenly I'm worth including in family events and asking for help with financial problems. And I watched them squirm under the accuracy of my assessment, watched them confront what they had done and who they had been. I reached into my bag and pulled out my checkbook, the leather cover embossed with my initials, and I opened it slowly, while everyone watched in silence. And I said clearly, I'll pay your $8,200, all of it, today. And I watched my parents' faces transform with relief, watched my mother reach toward me with trembling hands, and my father's shoulders sag as though a crushing weight had been lifted. I held up one hand to stop their approach and said, But you need to understand what this is. You need to understand exactly what's happening here. This is me helping my parents in a financial crisis because despite everything you've done, you're still my parents, and I won't let you lose your home. And I clicked my pen and began writing the check with deliberate precision, my handwriting steady and clear. I continued speaking while I wrote. This is not me earning my place in this family. This is not me buying your approval or your respect or your recognition. This is not me proving I'm worthy of sitting at your table or being included in your celebrations. And I tore the check from the book with a clean rip and held it in my hand without offering it yet. I looked at my mother directly and said, I don't need you to value me now. I don't need you to suddenly see my worth because I have money in the bank and a title on my business card. I needed you to value me my whole life. I needed you to see me and believe in me and support me when I was struggling, when I was making $42,000 and driving a used Honda and living in a small apartment. And my voice cracked slightly, but I pushed through. My mother's face crumpled and tears streamed down her cheeks, and she whispered, Sarah, we're so sorry. We didn't realize what we were doing. We didn't understand how much we were hurting you. And my father stood up and said heavily, We got caught up in appearances, in status, in measuring success by all the wrong metrics. We failed you as parents, and there's no excuse for that. Marcus cleared his throat and said quietly, I was cruel to you, Sarah. I mocked you and dismissed you and made you feel small. And I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry for the person I was and the way I treated you. And I saw something like shame in his eyes that looked real and raw. Jennifer twisted her hands together and said, I thought I was better than you. I thought my life and my marriage and my status made me superior, and I was wrong. I was so wrong. You accomplished everything on your own merit while I just married into success. And her voice shook with what sounded like genuine remorse. I held the check and looked at each of them and said, I appreciate your apologies. I do. And I believe you mean them right now in this moment. But this relationship changes from this point forward. The dynamic we've had for my entire life ends today. And I let that statement settle over the room like a declaration of independence. I placed the check on the coffee table between us and said clearly, I will be at family events because you're my parents and Marcus and Jennifer are my siblings. And I will help in emergencies like this one because that's what decent people do for their families, regardless of how they've been treated. But I will not be dismissed or diminished or treated as less than ever again. And I watched them absorb this new reality. I continued, my voice steady and firm. I'm requiring family therapy, all of us together, with a qualified therapist who specializes in family dynamics. Because these patterns didn't develop overnight, and they won't disappear with one conversation and some apologies made under financial duress. And my mother nodded immediately, while my father looked uncomfortable, but didn't object. I looked at Marcus and Jennifer and said, I'm requiring that you treat me as an equal, that you ask about my life with genuine interest, that you celebrate my achievements the way you expect yours to be celebrated, and that you check your condescension and your assumptions at the door. And Marcus met my eyes and nodded while Jennifer whispered that she would. My father picked up the check with shaking hands and looked at the amount and then at me, and he said, Sarah, this is more than generous, this saves everything for us. And I replied, I know it does, and I'm glad I can help. But Dad, you need to understand that I would have helped you 2 years ago if you'd asked. I would have figured out a way to contribute, even when I was making $42,000, because that's who I am, but you never saw me as someone who could help with anything. The words hung in the air, and I watched my father's face crumble as he understood what he had lost by dismissing me for so many years, as he calculated all the moments of connection and support he had thrown away because he was too focused on status markers to see his daughter's actual character. We talked for another hour, establishing what the new family dynamic would look like, and I was clear and specific about my expectations because I had learned in business that vague agreements lead to disappointing outcomes, and my family needed concrete guidelines for how to treat me with respect. When I finally left that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because they had apologized or because they finally recognized my success, but because I had stood up for myself and demanded the treatment I deserved, and they had agreed to my terms. The months that followed were not easy because changing decades-old patterns never is. But my parents attended family therapy sessions every week and worked genuinely on understanding how they had created a hierarchy among their children based on external measures of success. Marcus called me in March to ask for advice on a career decision, and for the first time in our relationship, he listened to my input as though I were someone whose opinion mattered. And when I gave him a strategy that worked, he thanked me with real gratitude. Jennifer invited me to lunch in April, just the two of us, and she talked about feeling lost in her marriage and uncertain of her own identity, apart from her husband's success. And I listened and offered support and realized she had her own pain that I had never seen. My parents sold their larger house and downsized to something manageable, and my father closed his failing business and found work that was less prestigious but more stable, and I watched them let go of the appearances they had clung to for so long. When the next Christmas approached, I drove to my parents' new smaller house with a mixture of hope and caution, knowing that healing was happening, but that trust took time to rebuild. And when I walked through the door, my mother hugged me tightly and said, I'm so glad you're here. Dinner was different this year. The conversation distributed equally among all three siblings, and when Marcus talked about his work, my father asked engaged questions, and when Jennifer discussed her new part-time job, my mother showed genuine interest, and when I mentioned a speaking engagement at an industry conference, everyone wanted to hear details. My father stood at the end of the meal and raised his glass and said, To all my children, each successful in their own way, each valuable not for what they earn or what they own, but for who they are, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that truth. And his voice broke with emotion. I raised my glass and met each person's eyes around the table, and I felt something inside me that had been broken for so long finally begin to heal. not because they had validated my worth, but because I had claimed it for myself and taught them how to treat me. And I understood that my real victory had nothing to do with the salary or the title or the money in my bank account, and everything to do with the fact that I finally knew my own value, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it.